Hello, welcome to our podcast series, Dialoguing with the Other and Myself. I'd like to welcome Dr. Anna Marie Ball, who's had an illustrious career in international development as a behavioral scientist in many places in Africa. And we're going to speak to her today about identity as a third culture kid and as an expat working in the international space. Welcome, Anna Marie.
Thanks, Anita.
Anna Marie, I wanted you to just start telling us a little bit about your story briefly, generally your origins and how you've moved as a child and later as an adult. Wonder if you could just tell us briefly about that.
Okay. I was born to Canadian parents in Canada. And my earliest memories are of my parents preparing to go to Zambia. And that is something that has defined my life for a long time. So the next decade and a half was about being in Zambia and returning to Canada and back in Zambia. Did my primary school in Zambia, secondary school in Canada, did my university in Canada, but the research that I did for both my master's and my PhD were in Botswana. And then as I started my career, it has mostly been in Africa, in various countries, and in various sectors. So I've lived throughout Africa, in the US, and I'm currently in the UK.
Great. Well, you mentioned that you spent much of your childhood in Zambia, and I wonder how these early years influenced your sense of identity and the direction you chose for your professional and personal life, and how, the label of third culture kid really related to you as in your identity.
Well, for your listeners, a third culture kid is somebody who has grown up in a place that is different from their parents' place. And so that's during the formative years, that's the thing that defines what a third culture kid is. It's a term that was coined in the 1950s to describe this thing that was being observed. So, as you say, this has really defined things for me. My formative years were in Zambia, so I relate to things that are more about Zambia than Canada. And my feeling of rootedness is more on the African continent than it is in Canada. And I knew from a very early age, actually, that I wanted to return to Africa to work as an adult, and that pretty much focused all of my education, because I had that goal of getting back to Africa. How was I going to get there, and what would it take?
And so it's interesting, you mentioned something in previous conversations about how the African landscape, the languages, the music differed from the Canadian one in defining your identity. I wonder if you could give some examples of how this differed and some of the searching you did in trying to find your place in Canada and Africa.
Yes, well, that's really true. I relate more to climate-wise. I relate more to a 2 or 3 season year, not the traditional winter, spring, autumn, or summer and autumn. You can't even get them straight. That's very foreign to me. So what I grew up with was warmth, with more of a savanna landscape, African music, different languages, and so when I went to Canada, I felt like a total stranger, because I didn't know what it meant to live in winter. I really don't like winter, and I remember very clearly one of our first winters as a family back in Canada. We were living in a place that got a lot of snow, And my parents said, well, you guys have to go out and shovel the driveway. And shock horror to them, their children had no idea how to shovel snow because we didn't grow up with it. So it's little things like that that make the difference. Because I was not in Canada during my formative years, I have this huge cultural gap. I don't know what the popular songs were or what the TV programs were that people were watching when they were growing up. And in any particular gathering of my peers in Canada, when people start reminiscing, oh, what did you listen to? Or do you remember this song or that? I have no knowledge of that. So when I was in Canada in my university years, and it was the realization that as much as I wanted to be Zambian, I would never be considered Zambian, and no amount of wishing would ever make it happen. So I decided, well, I have a Canadian passport. I better find out about this country that I'm in and that has issued me this passport, and see if there's anything that I can love about this place. And so I remember very deliberately starting a Love Canada campaign for myself. And I deliberately exposed myself to Canadian folk music. I tried to travel throughout the country to see things and to see what's a Canadian, and how can I grab some things that I love, and I found those things. I found music that I loved. I found that being out in the rural areas, particularly in the area where there are lakes, freshwater lakes, I thought, wow, this is fantastic. So I had to do that in order to find some kind of Canadian identity.
So you had to actively search it. You had to actively create experiences for yourself and do research to create an identity that was given to you that wasn't necessarily one that you experienced in early childhood. So it was kind of actively rather than passively.
Yes. And in fact, to use those skills that you would use if you went to a foreign country, how do I explore this country? I had to apply those same skills to this country that I was supposed to belong to, and create it that way.
So that's really interesting, because it brings me to that question of your choice to actually have most of your career in Africa in the end, and actually be in Africa. I think you spent the better part of 20-25 years in your career.
Or longer.
Longer. And I wondered, so you consider yourself an expat, yet most of your life has been in Africa. What has that meant for you? In defining yourself as an expat, coming from being a third culture kid, trying to actively create this Canadian identity, and then repatriating yourself to a place where you spent most of your life. So I wondered what that meant for you.
Well, I think I relate more to the identity of third culture kid than expatriate, because I think the expatriate is just a continuation of what I had as a child. So yeah, it was, do I want to stay in Canada, or do I want to go back to Africa? And I guess I just knew that.
That was your place.
That was my place, that I wanted. My parents had been involved in service, and so it was a natural thing for me to think about. It took a while for me to figure out what my career was, but once I did, the intent was always, I'm going to practice this in Africa. And it was very deliberate, because there are many people that are involved in international development that stay in their home countries, such as Canada or United States or wherever, and they are involved with NGOs or research or whatever. from a distance. And I knew that I didn't want to do that. I wanted to be on the ground. I wanted to work with people in whichever African country I was going to work in. That's where I wanted to be located, because I felt that there was much more learning, and it was just more interesting for me.
So that kind of brings me to a question. How has it been being a white woman? How has that influenced your role as a leader and professional in international development in Africa? And I had a kind of a corollary question, which you may or may not be able to answer, but there's a lot of work going around decolonizing global health or decolonizing international development. So maybe you can answer the first question, and if you can answer the second part of the question, you're welcome to.
Yeah. Well, I think key to this is, yes, I was in a leadership position, and I think when you are a leader, you have to. I think a good leader develops good self-awareness, because you need to look at what are the things that are enabling or obstacles in your way about yourself as a leader. And so for me, yes, I had to consider that I am a woman and I am white. So how does that work for me? How does that work against me? And because I always had a team that I was working with, a national team, I could sort of play that off if I needed to. If I needed to be the front person, then I could be. If my color or my gender was going to get in the way of good work, then you allow somebody else to take that front role. So I guess gender and race are important, but they're only part of the picture. It's actually quite nuanced from my perspective. And so I can never say, well, because I was white, it was this way. Because I was a woman, it was that way. I've experienced times when I've been discriminated because of my color. Then it's little things. It's little things like if I go to the market to buy vegetables, I'm going to pay a higher price because my skin color is white. Okay, there we go. I remember applying for a job where I was completely qualified. I was shortlisted, went to the interview, and the panel actually said to me, "Why did you even bother applying for this job?" Because it was very clear that they wanted a Black African woman. And even though all of the qualifications, I filled those qualifications to abundance, I didn't look right for the job. And so I didn't get it. In that case, it played against me. But there are other times your color opens the door. In terms of gender, most of the time in Africa, I never felt that gender was, being a woman was a problem. There are lots of women in high leadership positions, and so that was never really an issue. But you do have to stay aware of it. And I think that, we have a long history of knowing that there's a difference. Women and men are treated differently, even in the workplace. I worked for an engineering company where I was the only woman in leadership position. And I would say that there have been situations where I felt that because I was a woman, I was not listened to, but not on a day-to-day basis. within the places that I worked.
Yeah. So that's really interesting because I think, as we said, the color and the gender plays itself out in different ways in different situations, depending on where you are. And the notion of decolonizing global health or international development is a nuanced one about what that means in the relations between countries and between people as diversity becomes more and more important. And also, interestingly enough, you identified with the African continent very, very strongly and really invested time there. So your identity, despite being white or brown or black, is invested in a land and with people that, people wouldn't obviously see when they look at you. So what does that mean for you as your life as an expat and third culture kid impacting your sense of belonging and where you belong and your feeling of belonging?
Mm. Well, before I answer that, Nita, I just want to say that the Africa that I grew up in is vastly different from the Africa that we have now.
Okay.
And that is, people are very educated now. I mean, education has come, and so it is I guess this is going to the decolonization question, although it's not really going to answer it. But me working in Africa was about bringing my skills into an arena that couldn't be filled by somebody, a national. And that's really important, I think, to note, because most of my colleagues were educated Africans. And that's the wonderful thing, that now when you go to any African country, what you will see is that there are professional Africans from other countries working around the continent. And I think that as we see that more and more, the higher you go up in your career, the more Africans there are to take those jobs, as there should be. So I think that there's a natural progression that happens there. So then to my identity, sorry, can you repeat that question?
Yeah, sure. I was just wondering how it impacted your sense of belonging, being a culture kid and an expat. And
well, I've heard of third culture kids being described as people that are from everywhere and belong nowhere, and truly one of the hardest questions that you can ask a third culture kid is, where are you from? And that will just tongue tie anybody, because it's hard. You don't, if you're being honest. So sense of belonging was something that I had to work at, and that goes back to my stories about trying to find something that I could love in Canada. I still don't really feel like I belong in Canada, but I guess as you mature and you get more experiences in life, then you take these things that comfort you as belonging and you carry them with you. And whether that's experiences, it's probably not going to be a place, because you've been to a lot of places. And so I have quite a global community, and that is something that helps me belong. Where my family is, that is a sense of belonging. It even comes down to things that you carry with you in your suitcase. I came across something, a wooden carving of a hippo, which is quite battered, but I know that it came from Zambia from my childhood, and for some reason it always ended up in my suitcase. And so it has become one of those things that travels with me to remind me of where I belong. And people do this with lots of other things, and that just happens to be mine. And here he was sitting on my desk, and it kind of made me smile because I don't really think about it, but I see it. So there are a funny mixture of things that that create a sense of belonging for a TCK.
Oh, it's really interesting, the little hippo carving. That's interesting. I have a little exercise for you that we do in the workshops. Imagine you're in the middle of a little paper that's you, Anna Marie, and around are little circles of descriptors, of identity descriptors. And I wondered if you could just tell me some of those descriptors of you, Anna Marie.
That's an interesting one. Well, I'm part of a big family. I think I'm a curious person, and that leads to a lot of learning. I'm quite invested in people. What else would I say? I'm still a wanderer. I still I'm living in another country. I'm in the UK. I'm grounded in nature, far more than I ever thought I was. So I would say I'm a rural dweller as opposed to an urban dweller. I guess those would be some of the descriptors.
Okay,
I should say I'm a behavioral scientist. So
thank you. Well, I mean, that was really illuminating. And I think that people would really understand your story and put it in the context also of how international development has evolved over time. And I think what I found interesting was that how your identity has evolved over time, but what you've seen is also the fact that Africans have become educated and professionals and are leading their country. And I think that's a testimony to some of the successes that we've seen in investing in international development. So thank you very much, Anna Marie. I really appreciated the time you took to record this podcast with us. And I look forward to further conversations with you.
thanks, Nita.